lonely rancher saved a wounded Apache girl, but 50 warriors showed up the Arizona desert, stretched endlessly under the harsh sun, its dry wind carrying the faint smell of sagebrush and dust. For miles, there was nothing but rocky hills, scattered cacti, and the occasional flight of a hawk circling high above. In this vast, lonely land lived a rancher named Thomas McAllister. He was a man shaped by solitude and hard work, a man who had long ago accepted that his only companions were the cattle he tended and the stars that lit his nights. Thomas had lived on this isolated ranch for more than 20 years, far from towns or neighbors, relying on his own skills to survive. Life was quiet, predictable, and safe, or at least as safe as the wilderness allowed. That morning, Thomas rose early, as he always did, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. The sky was a pale orange, and the air carried a slight chill. He saddled his horse Dusty and rode out to check the distant parts of his land where some of his cattle had been wandering. The desert was alive with the sound of birds and the distant rustle of small creatures. But Thomas was used to it. He noticed every detail, the dry crack of a branch underfoot, the movement of a lizard darting across the sand, the wind shifting through the rocks. Years of solitude had sharpened his senses, made him alert to even the slightest change in his environment. As he reached a narrow canyon, Dusty snorted and pawed at the ground nervously. Thomas frowned, glancing around. It was unusual for his horse to act this way without reason. Then he heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, carried by the wind. At first he thought it might be the whistle of the wind through the rocks, but then he heard it again, a small, broken cry, weak but urgent. Thomas froze, listening carefully. He had learned long ago that the desert could be both beautiful and deadly. That sound was human. Cautiously, he guided Dusty down a rocky slope, moving toward the sound. The closer he got, the more distinct the cries became, filled with fear and pain. Finally, behind a cluster of boulders, he saw her, a young girl, barely more than a child, lying on the ground. Her clothes were torn, and her face was streaked with dirt and dried blood. She was shivering, even though the sun was climbing higher, and her eyes were wide with fear. Thomas dismounted slowly, hands raised slightly to show he meant no harm. The girl tried to move but winced in pain, clutching her side. She was clearly wounded, likely from some recent accident or attack. Thomas's heart tightened. He had seen many hardships in his life, but this was different. She was alone, vulnerable, and terrified in the middle of a harsh desert. He knew that leaving her here would be a death sentence. Despite his natural caution and distrust of strangers, especially in such remote territory, he stepped closer. "Hey," he said gently, his voice calm and steady. "It's okay. I won't hurt you." The girl flinched at his words, but didn't move away. Her dark eyes studied him suspiciously, filled with a mixture of fear and hope. Thomas realized she might not speak English well, or at all, but her fear was universal. He carefully knelt beside her, examining her injuries. There were cuts along her arms and legs, and her side had a deep bruise, likely from a fall or strike. She winced again when he reached toward her. "I'm going to help you," Thomas said softly. "Can you stand?" The girl shook her head slowly, unable to speak. Thomas could see the terror in her eyes, the helplessness of someone who had been alone and afraid for too long. He gently lifted her into his arms. She was surprisingly light for her age, but her body trembled from shock and weakness. Dusty nickered softly, as if sensing the urgency of the moment. Thomas carried her back to his horse, wrapping her in a spare blanket he had brought along. He mounted carefully, making sure she was secure in front of him. The ride back to the ranch was slow. The girl clung to the blanket, her face pressed against it, trying to hide from the unknown. Thomas spoke softly all the way, telling her where they were going, reassuring her that she would be safe. She didn't respond, but the slight relaxation in her body told him she was beginning to trust him, even if just a little. When they reached the ranch, Thomas set her down on a bed he had prepared in the spare room. He brought water and a simple meal, watching her cautiously as she sipped and ate. She moved slowly, wincing with every motion, but she was alive, and for Thomas, that was all that mattered. Over the next few hours, he cleaned her wounds with care, using the supplies he always kept for emergencies. He spoke softly, even though she could barely understand, because sometimes the sound of a calm voice was more important than the words themselves. The girl finally spoke a few broken words, a language Thomas didn't understand, but her tone was full of relief. She pointed to herself and then to Thomas, repeating something over and over. He shook his head, realizing he didn't know her name yet, but he understood enough to know she was thanking him. That small gesture, or attempt to communicate, was enough to deepen the bond forming between them. As the sun set that evening, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Thomas sat in his chair near the fire while the girl slept. He thought about the long, lonely years he had spent on the ranch, and how abruptly this child had entered his life. There were so many questions. Where did she come from? What had happened to her family? Would she be safe with him? And yet all of that was secondary to the immediate need. She was hurt, frightened, and alone, and he could not ignore that. For the first time in many years, Thomas felt the weight of responsibility for someone else's life in a very real, immediate way. His heart, hardened by years of solitude, softened just a little. He realized that the desert, though harsh and unforgiving, could also be a place where unexpected bonds could form. And as the night deepened, he resolved to protect this girl, to nurse her back to health, and to do everything in his power to ensure she survived the dangers that lay both in the wilderness and beyond. Outside, the wind whispered through the rocks and sagebrush, carrying with it the quiet sounds of the desert night. Thomas knew the challenges ahead would be many, but for now he watched over the girl who had appeared out of nowhere, wounded and frightened. In that quiet, lonely ranch house, a connection began. A fragile, tentative trust between a solitary man and a child who had lost everything. The night was long, but for the first time in years, Thomas did not feel entirely alone. The next morning, the desert sunlight poured into the small ranch house, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Thomas awoke early, as he always did, and quietly checked on the girl. She was still asleep, her small chest rising and falling steadily. Her dark hair, now brushed back from her face, shone in the soft light. Seeing her peaceful for a moment brought a rare smile to Thomas's face. He had spent years alone, his only company being the quiet hum of the land and the occasional stray animal. Yet here was a life, fragile and uncertain, depending on him. The thought filled him with both responsibility and something he hadn't felt in a long time: care for another human being. When the girl finally awoke, she rubbed her eyes and looked around the room cautiously. Her gaze fell on Thomas, who was sitting in the chair by the window, quietly observing her. She flinched slightly at his presence, but she did not retreat. Instead, she pointed to herself and whispered her name in her native tongue. Thomas listened carefully, trying to repeat the sounds. "Anna," he said slowly, and the girl's face brightened at his attempt. Though he pronounced it poorly, she nodded and smiled, a tiny gesture that filled the room with warmth. Breakfast was a simple affair, cornmeal mush and fresh water, but it became an unspoken ritual that helped bridge the distance between them. The girl ate slowly, her movements careful as she nursed her injuries. Thomas watched silently, offering words of encouragement when she looked at him uncertainly. Though they did not yet speak the same language, communication came through gestures, tone, and shared understanding. Every small smile, every nod, was a step toward trust. After breakfast, Thomas realized the girl needed more than food and rest. She needed to regain strength and mobility, to heal not just her wounds but the fear that had driven her into the wilderness alone. He led her outside to a quiet spot near the barn where the sun warmed the ground. Slowly, carefully, he showed her simple exercises, walking short distances, stretching her arms and bending her legs gently. At first she struggled, wincing at the slightest movement, but Thomas remained patient, guiding her with steady hands and gentle words. During these exercises, the girl began to relax. She laughed quietly when Dusty the horse nuzzled her hand, startled by her own courage. She began to speak fragments of her story, pointing to the distant mountains, miming running and showing fear through her eyes. Thomas pieced together what he could. Her village had been attacked. She had been separated from her family, and she had wandered alone for days. Her journey through the desert had been perilous, yet she had survived, a testament to her resilience and spirit. Over the next several days, Thomas established a routine. The mornings were for tending the land and checking on the cattle, while the afternoons were spent helping the girl regain strength. He built a small splint for her injured arm and fashioned bandages to keep her cuts clean. He taught her how to catch water from the cistern, how to identify edible plants, and how to move safely through the rugged terrain near the ranch. Each lesson was met with curiosity and determination on her part, and Thomas found himself impressed by her quick learning. Beyond the practical lessons, Thomas also taught her about the world he knew. He showed her how to read the sky for signs of weather, how to listen for distant sounds in the desert, and how to track the movement of animals. These lessons were not just about survival, they were about trust and patience. With each passing day, the girl's confidence grew, and so did the bond between them. In turn, the girl shared her own knowledge. She showed Thomas how to recognize certain herbs that could be used to soothe pain or treat minor illnesses. She mimed techniques for moving quietly, for blending into the environment, and even small cultural practices she held dear. At first, Thomas listened with polite interest, but soon he realized the value of her teachings. Her perspective, shaped by her experiences in the wild and her own people, offered insights he had never known. They began to learn from each other, a mutual respect forming through shared knowledge. Evenings were filled with quiet conversations and storytelling. Thomas would sit near the fire, listening as the girl mimed tales of her childhood, the people she had loved, and the life she had once known. Though much of it was lost in translation, the emotions were clear: joy, fear, loss, and hope. Thomas shared stories of his own youth, his years working the ranch, and the challenges he had faced alone in the wilderness. In those moments, they were no longer merely teacher and student or rescuer and rescued. They were companions, sharing the human experience, bridging the gap of culture and language with patience and empathy. But life in the desert was never without its tensions. Thomas remained aware that danger could appear at any moment, that the world outside his ranch was not always forgiving. He kept watch during the nights, guarding the girl from potential threats, whether from wild animals or other humans. Though he could not anticipate every risk, his presence offered a measure of safety she had not known in weeks. The girl, for her part, began to relax under his protection, her fear gradually giving way to cautious trust. One afternoon, while walking along a ridge that overlooked the ranch, the girl suddenly stopped. She pointed to the horizon, her eyes wide with concern. Thomas followed her gaze and saw the faint dust clouds of distant riders. He signaled for her to stay calm, though his own heart quickened. The desert could be full of surprises, and the appearance of strangers especially in a remote area, was never to be taken lightly. The girl seemed to sense the tension in him, and for the first time she clung to him as if seeking reassurance. Thomas placed a steady hand on her shoulder, silently telling her that they would face whatever came together. Days passed, and the bond between Thomas and the girl deepened further. He noticed small habits she had developed, how she would smile at Dusty, how she began to imitate some of his movements, and how she started to feel more at home in the ranch house. She even began to speak a few English words, stumbling over pronunciation but determined to communicate. Thomas responded patiently, correcting her gently and celebrating every success. Each word, each gesture, was a victory in the slow but steady building of trust. At night, when the desert wind whistled softly through the canyon, Thomas would sit by the fire while the girl slept. He reflected on the fragility of life, the randomness of fate, and the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Here was a child who had endured unimaginable hardship, yet she was still alive, still hopeful, still capable of forming trust in the face of fear. Thomas felt a quiet pride in being able to protect her, to offer her a chance at safety and healing. The ranch, once a place of quiet solitude, had become a sanctuary of sorts. It was no longer just a home for a solitary man. It was a place where life, hope, and human connection converged. The girl's presence reminded Thomas that even in the harshest conditions, compassion and patience could create bonds that defied distance, culture, and circumstance. She had entered his life suddenly, unexpectedly, yet she had brought with her a renewed sense of purpose and a reminder of the human capacity for kindness. As the week drew to a close, Thomas realized that the girl was stronger, more confident, and beginning to feel comfortable in her new surroundings. She laughed more freely, explored the ranch with curiosity, and even helped with simple chores, mimicking his movements with a mixture of concentration and delight. Thomas watched her with a mixture of relief and admiration. The danger and fragility of her first arrival seemed a distant memory, replaced by a sense of cautious optimism and shared understanding. For Thomas, the experience was transformative. He had always believed that life in the desert was about survival alone, about enduring hardship without reliance on others. Yet here was proof that trust, compassion, and mutual care could flourish even in the harshest environments. The girl had taught him patience, humility, and the value of connection, and he had provided her with safety, guidance, and protection. Together they were learning that survival was not just about enduring the elements. It was about the human bonds that gave life meaning and hope. By the end of part 2, the rancher and the girl had established a fragile but growing trust. The girl was healing both physically and emotionally, and Thomas was learning the profound rewards of protecting and caring for another human being. The days ahead would bring new challenges, and the desert remained unpredictable. But for now, the ranch was a haven, and their shared bond was a lifeline in a world that could often be unforgiving. The mornings in the desert had grown warmer, and the light spilled across the ranch in golden streaks, highlighting the rugged beauty of the land. Thomas was used to these quiet mornings, the gentle sounds of cattle lowing and Dusty moving through the brush. But that day, something felt different. As he prepared for his morning chores, he noticed the girl standing at the edge of the yard, staring toward the horizon with wide, tense eyes. She did not speak, only pointing toward the distant mountains, her small hand trembling slightly. Thomas felt a chill despite the warm air. Her fear was clear, even without words. He walked over slowly, kneeling to her level. "What is it?" he asked softly. The girl looked at him, then back at the horizon, repeating a series of sounds that he did not understand. She pointed again, and this time Thomas followed her gaze more carefully. Far off in the distance, small clouds of dust rose along the dirt trail, carried by what appeared to be a group of riders. They were too far to make out details, but the movement, coordinated and purposeful, suggested more than ordinary travelers or wanderers. His heart began to beat faster. The girl tugged at his sleeve, her eyes pleading. She pointed to herself, then to him, and then made a motion across the land as if to say, "They are coming for me." Thomas's mind raced. He had known this day might come. The girl was not from his world, and eventually her past might catch up with her. Yet seeing the first signs of danger in such a tangible way sent a jolt of urgency through him. He placed a steady hand on her shoulder, giving a reassuring squeeze. "It's okay," he said, though his own voice betrayed the tension he felt. "We'll be ready." Back inside the ranch house, Thomas quickly considered their options. He had always relied on preparation, keeping his home and surroundings secure. But now he needed to think beyond ordinary precautions. The girl watched him carefully, sensing both his concern and his determination. Though she could not fully understand every word, she felt the protective energy radiating from him. Together, silently, they moved through the ranch, checking doors, securing supplies, and preparing for the unexpected. Thomas also knew that confrontation might not be necessary if handled wisely. He did not want to escalate the situation. This was not a fight he sought. He only wanted to protect the girl and ensure her safety. He took her hand and led her to a hidden nook behind the barn, a place where they could remain unseen from anyone approaching the property. He gestured for her to stay calm, demonstrating through careful movements what she should do if someone came too close. She mimicked his gestures with precision, her fear mixing with determination. As they waited, Thomas observed the land around them. The desert was vast, with ridges and rocky outcrops providing natural cover. He realized that their knowledge of the terrain could serve as an advantage. He could guide the girl to safety if the need arose, using paths only he knew. Yet he also knew the girl's knowledge of her own culture and people might provide insights he could not anticipate. Together they represented two perspectives, two survival strategies, united by a growing bond and shared concern. Hours passed, and the sun rose higher, casting sharper shadows across the landscape. The girl's eyes never left the horizon, scanning for any movement. Thomas spoke softly, telling her stories to distract her from fear, describing his days on the ranch, the routines of the cattle, and small lessons he had learned from the land. She responded with gestures and broken words, the communication slow but meaningful. Every shared smile or nod was a tiny victory against the anxiety building in both of them. Eventually, the dust clouds on the horizon began to grow larger. Thomas could see movement more clearly now, the faint glint of sunlight on metal, the deliberate pace of multiple riders. He estimated that it was not a small group. His mind calculated the distance, the speed, and the possible number of people approaching. He counted at least a dozen riders, though he suspected there might be more hidden behind the ridges. The girl pressed close to him, her small hands gripping his jacket. She whispered something in her language, her voice urgent and pleading. Though Thomas could not understand the words, he felt their weight. This was not a casual visit. They were coming with intent. Thomas took a deep breath. He knew that panic would not help either of them. He needed to remain calm, think clearly, and prepare for negotiation or defense if necessary. He had never been a man to back down from protecting someone, and now the stakes were personal. The girl's safety was in his hands, and he refused to let fear dictate their next actions. Carefully, he guided her to the interior of the barn, a space he had reinforced months before for storage. It offered shelter and a vantage point from which they could observe without being immediately seen. From their hidden spot, Thomas and the girl watched as the riders approached the ranch. The wind carried faint sounds, the clatter of hooves on dirt, low calls exchanged between the riders. The girl's face reflected both recognition and apprehension. She began to whisper words rapidly, her gestures pointing toward each rider, as if explaining their intentions to Thomas. Though he struggled to interpret the details, he understood the general message. These were people from her past, likely her own community, and their approach could be dangerous if not handled carefully. Thomas knew he needed a plan. He considered speaking to them from a safe distance, showing that they meant no harm. He considered retreating to the hills, using the land itself as protection. But most importantly, he understood that the girl needed to feel secure. He knelt beside her, lowering himself to her eye level, and mimicked a calm, steady breath. "We can handle this together," he said. Though his words were simple, the tone conveyed determination and reassurance. She mirrored his breaths, slowly letting some of her tension ease. As the riders drew closer, the dust clouds now clearly showing the presence of many more than Thomas initially estimated, he realized that careful communication would be key. He chose a spot near the edge of the yard, visible but not immediately vulnerable, and prepared to speak with them. The girl stayed close, her small hands gripping his, her trust evident despite the fear. Thomas's heart pounded, not from danger alone, but from the responsibility he bore. Every action he took could determine the outcome of this encounter. When the riders finally arrived within sight, Thomas could see the faces of the men and women among them. They were Apache warriors, strong and serious, their expressions unreadable. Some glanced toward the girl, and recognition flashed briefly across their eyes. Thomas raised his hand slowly, a universal gesture of peace. He spoke clearly, addressing them in the most respectful tone he could muster, showing that he meant no harm, only wishing to protect the child who had come under his care. The girl, standing beside him, remained quiet but attentive. She understood that this moment required patience, that her life depended not on strength alone, but on careful interaction. Thomas gestured for her to step back slightly, ensuring she was safe while he continued to communicate with the approaching warriors. He could see their eyes scanning him, assessing his intentions, weighing trust against the unfamiliar. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. Every second felt like a test of courage, patience, and intuition. Thomas remembered the countless lessons the desert had taught him: observation, understanding, and restraint. He used each skill now, reading the subtle cues in the warriors' expressions, interpreting their movements, and responding with calm, steady gestures. The girl, sensing his confidence, began to relax further, her trust in him a guiding force in the tense moment. By the time the sun reached its peak, Thomas had established a fragile but crucial understanding with the approaching warriors. Through gestures, careful words, and mutual respect, he demonstrated that he had cared for the girl with compassion and that she was unharmed. The initial tension began to ease, though the situation remained delicate. Thomas knew that the coming hours would require patience and wisdom, and he was ready to act with both. As they waited, the girl leaned slightly against him, her small hand seeking comfort and reassurance. Thomas felt a deep sense of responsibility and connection. This child, who had arrived wounded and afraid, was now standing beside him in the face of an uncertain challenge. Their bond, forged through days of care, learning, and trust, would guide them through the trials that lay ahead. The desert air had grown warmer, and the sun beat down on the rocky plains surrounding Thomas's ranch. Dust rose in long waves across the horizon, announcing the approach of a large group. From his vantage point behind the barn, Thomas counted carefully, estimating at least 50 warriors now riding steadily toward the ranch. The girl, standing close beside him, clutched his arm tightly. Her dark eyes were wide with worry, and she whispered words in her own language, pointing toward the riders with urgency. Though Thomas could not understand everything, her meaning was clear. These were not casual visitors, and their intent was serious. Thomas's mind raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. He knew that panic would do no good. Any sudden movement or loud noise could escalate the situation unnecessarily. Instead, he focused on observation. The warriors moved with purpose, organized in a tight formation, their expressions unreadable but watchful. They were clearly skilled, disciplined, and aware of their surroundings. Thomas understood that this was a situation where courage alone would not suffice. Wisdom, patience, and respect would be equally important. He led the girl to a safer spot behind the barn, a small area hidden from direct view, where they could see the approaching group without being immediately noticed. "Stay close," he said quietly, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. She nodded, her small hands gripping his coat, drawing strength from his calm presence. Thomas realized that the girl's trust in him would be crucial in the moments to come. Her fear had not vanished, but with careful guidance she began to feel safer, knowing that he would not let harm come to her. When the warriors finally reached the open ground near the ranch, Thomas stepped forward slowly, showing his hands as a sign of peace. He spoke clearly, in the simplest words possible, demonstrating his intentions. "I do not mean harm," he said. "The girl is safe. I only wish to care for her." His voice was firm yet gentle, carrying the weight of sincerity. The warriors paused, scanning him carefully. Their eyes shifted to the girl, then back to Thomas. She remained behind him, silent but observant. Thomas understood that he was being judged, measured for trustworthiness. Every movement mattered. Every gesture could influence the outcome. He bowed his head slightly in respect, acknowledging their authority and their right to approach the situation on their own terms. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The wind stirred dust along the desert floor, and the only sounds were the distant call of a hawk and the rhythmic movement of hooves. Thomas focused on the small signs of communication, the nods, the shifts in posture, the subtle changes in eye contact. Gradually, he realized that respect and patience were bridging the gap between them. The warriors were cautious, yes, but they were listening, watching, trying to understand his intentions. He gestured toward the girl, then to himself, using simple motions to convey that she had been wounded and alone, and that he had offered care and protection. The girl mimicked his gestures as best she could, reinforcing the message without words. The warriors observed silently, their expressions softening slightly as they noticed her presence, her safety, and the careful way Thomas had treated her. One of the warriors, likely a leader, rode forward and raised a hand. Thomas understood this as an invitation to speak further or demonstrate his intentions more clearly. He stepped a little closer, keeping his movements deliberate and slow. He indicated that he would step aside, giving the girl space to respond if she wished. For the first time, she took a small step forward, her gaze meeting the leader's eyes. Though she did not speak, the gesture was meaningful. It showed recognition, respect, and a willingness to engage. The leader studied her carefully, then glanced back at Thomas. There was a long pause, filled only by the soft sounds of the desert wind and distant rustling in the brush. Then, slowly, the warrior lowered his hand, signaling acceptance. The tension that had gripped Thomas for hours eased slightly. The initial challenge of their encounter had passed, but he knew the situation was still delicate. Respect had been established, but trust would need to be reinforced. Over the next several hours, Thomas engaged in careful negotiation, using gestures, tone, and simple words to explain that his intentions were pure. The warriors observed the girl closely, ensuring she had been unharmed and treated well. Thomas showed them the supplies he had used to clean her wounds, the bandages he had made, and the food he had provided. He allowed the girl to demonstrate her recovery, showing how she could walk, stretch, and move with strength and confidence once again. The process was slow and methodical. Every small action mattered, and Thomas was mindful of cultural sensitivity and respect. He allowed the warriors to take the lead in observing and questioning, never interrupting or appearing aggressive. He maintained calm composure, steady voice, and consistent gestures of respect. The girl, sensing the seriousness of the moment, followed his example, remaining composed and observant. Her trust in Thomas guided her actions, and together they conveyed sincerity and honesty without needing a common language. As the sun moved higher in the sky, the initial tension between Thomas and the warriors softened into cautious understanding. They had assessed the situation, recognized the girl's safety, and acknowledged Thomas's role as her protector. Though the warriors' presence was imposing, their careful observation and measured responses indicated that respect and patience could bridge even the most challenging situations. Eventually, the leader signaled the others to ease back slightly, creating a space between Thomas, the girl, and the group. It was a silent acknowledgement that the immediate danger had passed, that communication had been effective, and that further discussion could take place in a controlled and respectful manner. Thomas took a small step back, allowing the girl to move closer to the leader if she wished. She hesitated at first, then stepped forward cautiously, her eyes meeting those of the leader with trust and recognition. The next few hours were spent establishing understanding and reassurance. Thomas allowed the girl to explain, as best she could, the circumstances that had led to her being alone and wounded. The warriors listened carefully, interpreting her gestures, words, and expressions. Thomas participated, translating through demonstration and clear action. By the end of the day, a fragile but firm bond had been formed. The warriors understood that the girl had been cared for, that her safety had been respected, and that Thomas's intentions had been genuine. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the desert, the group prepared to move on. The warriors gathered the girl, ready to return her to their community. Thomas stepped forward one last time, bowing slightly in respect, acknowledging their authority and expressing gratitude for their willingness to accept his care. The girl looked at him briefly, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief, affection, and hesitation. Though she would leave his direct care, she knew that he had protected her when she had needed it most. Thomas watched as they rode away, the girl safely among her people. Dust rose behind them in golden clouds, blending with the desert's warm tones. Though the ranch was quiet once again, Thomas felt a profound sense of fulfillment. He had faced a difficult situation with courage, respect, and patience. He had navigated fear, uncertainty, and cultural boundaries, ensuring the girl's safety and earning the trust of her community. As night fell, Thomas sat by the fire, reflecting on the events of the day. He thought about the delicate balance between courage and caution, trust and respect. He realized that the bond he had formed with the girl went beyond simple protection. It was a connection built on shared humanity, mutual respect, and understanding. Even in the harsh, unforgiving desert, compassion had created a bridge between two very different worlds. Though he would return to his solitary life once the dust settled, Thomas knew that this experience had changed him. The girl had reminded him of the importance of empathy, patience, and courage in the face of uncertainty. He understood that human connections, even temporary ones, could leave a lasting impact, shaping the way we view the world and the people around us. For Thomas, the ranch remained a place of quiet solitude, but it was no longer defined solely by isolation. It had become a space where trust, respect, and compassion had been tested and proven. The girl had entered his life unexpectedly, bringing challenges, lessons, and a renewed sense of purpose. Though she had returned to her community, her presence lingered in his thoughts, a reminder of the human capacity for courage, resilience, and connection. As the night deepened, the desert sky was filled with stars, each one shining brightly over the vast, rugged landscape. Thomas watched silently, reflecting on the day's events and the lessons learned. He felt a quiet peace, knowing that he had done all he could to protect someone in need, and that compassion had triumphed over fear. The girl was safe, her community reassured, and he had proven to himself that even in moments of uncertainty, humanity and courage could guide the way. The desert morning was quiet, the kind of stillness that Thomas had grown used to over his many years on the ranch. The wind barely stirred the sagebrush, and the sun rose slowly, painting the rocky landscape in shades of gold and red. The ranch felt empty without the girl, her laughter and curiosity absent from the morning routine. Yet Thomas did not feel the same kind of loneliness he had known before. Her presence had left a mark, a sense of life and connection that remained long after she had returned to her people. Thomas moved through the ranch, checking the fences and the water troughs, tending to the cattle as he always had. Every movement reminded him of the days spent with the girl, the careful tending of her injuries, the quiet walks through the hills, the shared stories by the fire. The ranch, once a place of isolation, now felt full of memory and meaning. It had become a home not just for him, but for the experiences that shaped the bond he had shared with another human being, even if only for a brief time. As he worked, he thought about the girl and the warriors who had come for her. He wondered how she was faring now, back among her people, and whether she remembered him with the same affection and trust that he remembered her. Thomas realized that life often moved in unexpected ways. Strangers could enter one's world suddenly, change it profoundly, and then leave, leaving only the lessons and the memories behind. Yet those brief connections could be some of the most meaningful of all. Over the following days, Thomas found himself reflecting more deeply on what had happened. He remembered the fear in the girl's eyes when he first found her, the way she had clung to him, and the cautious trust she had gradually developed. He remembered the long hours spent teaching her simple skills, helping her regain strength and showing her the ways of the ranch. And he remembered the tense encounter with her people, the careful negotiation, and the quiet moments of understanding that had prevented what could have been a disaster. Each memory was vivid, a reminder of the power of patience, compassion, and respect. Though he returned to his routines, Thomas began to notice small changes in himself. He moved through the desert with a heightened awareness of the life around him, noticing details he had previously taken for granted: the tracks of a rabbit, the song of a distant bird, the way the wind shifted through the rocks. He also noticed a new depth in his interactions with the land, a sense that caring for life extended beyond the cattle and crops. The girl had reminded him of the fragility and resilience of life, and that lesson stayed with him as he worked. Evenings became a time of quiet reflection. Thomas would sit near the fire, watching the flames flicker and listening to the distant sounds of the desert night. He thought about the girl, imagining her safe and smiling among her people. He imagined her sharing the stories of her time on the ranch, perhaps telling them about the man who had rescued her when she was alone and frightened. These thoughts filled him with a quiet satisfaction, a sense of having done something important, even if only in a small way. He also thought about the nature of human connection. For years he had believed that life in the desert was about self-reliance and solitude, but the experience with the girl had shown him that trust, compassion, and empathy were just as crucial for survival as skill and endurance. One could navigate the harshest landscapes alone, but true resilience came from the bonds we form, the care we show to others, and the courage we find to protect those who cannot protect themselves. As the days turned into weeks, Thomas noticed that the ranch itself seemed quieter, yet somehow fuller. The lessons he had shared with the girl, the stories they had exchanged, and the moments of mutual understanding had transformed the space. Even Dusty, his loyal horse, seemed to move with a little more energy, perhaps sensing the change in Thomas's own outlook. The desert remained harsh and unforgiving, but it also felt more alive, as if the shared experience had left an imprint on the very land around him. Occasionally, Thomas would think about the possibility of meeting the girl again. He wondered if she would remember him, if she would recognize the small acts of kindness and protection that had meant so much to both of them. Yet he also understood that life moved in its own rhythm. People came and went, circumstances changed, and sometimes the only way to honor a connection was to carry it quietly in one's heart. For Thomas, this realization brought peace. He had done his part, and that was enough. One afternoon, as he worked near the edge of the ranch, Thomas spotted a group of riders in the distance. He squinted against the sun, recognizing the figures as members of the girls' community. They waved from afar, and Thomas waved back, feeling a sense of recognition and shared understanding. He knew that the girl was among them, safe and cared for, and that the trust he had built had extended beyond the boundaries of his own experience. The sight brought a smile to his face, a reminder that his actions had made a lasting difference. Over time, Thomas reflected on the courage and resilience of the girl. She had faced incredible hardships, wandering alone in the desert while injured and vulnerable. Yet she had survived, relying on her instincts, her knowledge, and the small support he had been able to provide. Her determination and trust had inspired him, showing him that even in the harshest conditions, hope and resilience could thrive. Their shared experience had transformed both of them, creating a bond that transcended distance and circumstance. The ranch, once a symbol of solitude, had become a place of reflection and growth. Thomas understood that life was unpredictable and often challenging, but he also knew that moments of connection, compassion, and courage could create lasting change. The girl had entered his life suddenly, bringing both challenges and lessons, and though she had returned to her community, the impact of their shared experience would remain with him forever. As the sun set over the desert, Thomas stood on the ridge overlooking his land. The sky was painted in brilliant shades of orange, pink, and purple, and the shadows stretched long across the rugged terrain. He thought about the journey that had brought the girl to his ranch, about the trust and patience that had guided their interactions, and about the courage and understanding that had allowed them to face the warriors safely. Each memory was vivid and meaningful, a testament to the power of human connection. In that quiet moment, Thomas realized that he had been changed by the experience. The desert, though still harsh and lonely, now held a deeper meaning. It was not just a place of survival. It was a place where trust, compassion, and courage could flourish. He had learned that even brief connections could leave lasting impressions, shaping the way we view the world and the people around us. And he had learned that protecting and caring for another person, even one so different from himself, could bring a profound sense of purpose and fulfillment. As night fell, the stars began to shine brightly over the desert. Thomas sat quietly, reflecting on the lessons of the past weeks. The girl had returned to her community, safe and well, and he had ensured that she had been protected and cared for. He felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that his actions had mattered, that his compassion had made a difference in someone else's life. The memory of her small hand in his, her trust in his guidance, and the courage she had shown in the face of fear would stay with him always. Though he would continue his solitary life on the ranch, Thomas knew that he was no longer the same man he had been before. The experience had left a lasting impact, reminding him of the importance of empathy, courage, and human connection. He had learned that even in isolation, one could find meaning and fulfillment through the care and protection of others. The girl had come into his life unexpectedly, bringing lessons that would stay with him forever, and though their paths had diverged, the bond they had formed would endure quietly, like the stars shining over the vast desert night. And so Thomas McAllister returned to his daily routines, tending to his land and cattle with renewed purpose. He worked with patience and care, reflecting on the strength and resilience of the girl he had saved and on the courage required to face uncertainty with trust and compassion. The desert remained rugged and vast, but for Thomas it was no longer a place of mere survival. It had become a landscape of memory, meaning, and quiet triumph, shaped forever by the unexpected encounter that had changed his life. In the end, the rancher understood that the true measure of life was not found in solitude alone, but in the connections we form, the lives we touch, and the courage we show in protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The girl had reminded him of this truth, and her presence, though now absent, remained alive in his thoughts, his heart, and the land he called home.